Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Ryan Lee, once again back here as your host. I hope you are still staying safe amongst the pandemic, and we have got a load of things to talk about, including some of the latest released footage on pro days. We've got 3 athletes to go over, all of which whose pro days have actually come into the surface in terms of their footage. And then we're going to be coming into a bit of a unique topic, actually. We have a QB ranking that I think is actually really interesting, especially because this particular reporter has actually been very accurate over the last several years in terms of his quarterback rankings, but we'll get more into that a little bit later. So let's just get right into it. So last week, I went through a lot of stuff. I went over the whole situation regarding Les Miles and the sexual harassment charges back during his time at LSU. And then I basically just took a whole 20-minute, 30-minute deep dive into Trevor Lawrence, into how he's grown as a player, into how he performed at his pro day, in terms of the situation he's going through right now regarding his surgery and physical therapy on his non-throwing shoulder. I kind of tore into physical therapy a little bit because of the fact that I have had to go through it myself when I had to get ankle surgery a couple years ago. And I'm not going to lie to you, physical therapy is not the most fun thing in the world, especially if it's due to any sort of procedure where you just can't use a certain body part for extended periods of time. And for me, what that extended period of time meant was that I couldn't walk for 2 months. It was a little more than that, actually. It was actually about 2.5 months. I couldn't walk at all. I was on crutches the whole time. And it kind of felt a little demoralizing not being able to walk. And going back into physical therapy post-surgery, making sure the bone was all healed up, making sure that all of my plates and my screws were in the right place before I could even think about, putting more weight on it, doing all of the stretching and a little bit of mobility and balance for, an ankle, having to go into like a walker kind of ordeal. It was not the most fun thing in the world. And kind of slowly getting back into that process, it's emotionally tolling on you. It's mentally tolling on you. And, for Trevor, I can't imagine it being too thrilling either, especially because he's going to be out for at least 5 to 6 months. And the question for him is whether or not he'll be ready to start the season off. I expect the same thing that happened last year when it came to drafting and evaluations, and when it came to bringing players in for the OTAs. It's all voluntary. It's going to be very restrictive. All of the draft is going to be virtual. Even the combines have actually been a little bit different. And actually get right into that first, because the combine situation this year is actually very different compared to previous years. Because this year, for obvious reasons, there's going to be no combine. But the next closest thing we're going to be getting is a bunch of pro days coming in, and a bunch of all of these athletes who are going to be able to showcase what they can do, whether if it's certain drills or if for the quarterback, all these different throws and the receivers, the routes they're going to make, most likely from the same quarterbacks, and the different types of evaluation when it comes to things like their speed and their strength, and in terms of quarterbacks, their accuracy. Almost everything you would normally see in a pro day or combine type of setting for the specific position. And we kind of saw a lot of this getting led by Tua Tagovailoa last year, especially because of the fact that he opted out of going to the combine, but choosing to have the more pro-style type of evaluation instead of going to the combine, especially with everything going on right now. And I kind of went into this tangent. I don't remember if it was in the last segment or a couple of weeks ago, but I remember talking about how the combine is not important because players want to really showcase how good they can be, in terms of being a pure athlete. Coaches don't really look at that, especially if it kind of lines up with what they already see on tape. However, if you see something that's significantly different, things that are a little bit off the charts, then a coach is more inclined to potentially reach a little bit for that player. We saw it with John Ross when he ran that 4.22 at the combine, setting the record. We saw it with DK Metcalf when he just showed what an absolute beast of an animal he is. We saw it a couple of years ago with Shaquem Griffin, the linebacker for the Seattle Seahawks, who had to use a prosthetic to do the bench press drill. Almost every single drill that those guys did, they were one of the tops in the position group. And because they performed so well, their draft stock actually rose. And within that late first to fourth, it's a whole bunch of people who are very close in terms of talent, but the flaws might be what sets them apart from one team to another. And going into that, it really sets the example of why that type of experience is so important. But with everything going on, it just isn't feasible because, there's still a deadly virus going on in the air. So the way that a lot of these schools and a lot of these players have been able to compensate for that is by hosting pro days. Now, Tua was really the big trendsetter on this, where he did all of his throws to, I don't remember if they were receivers or if they were receiver coaches or whatever it was, but Tua essentially didn't go to the combine, but instead he ran all the combine drills, if I'm not mistaken. He just showed what he could do with his arm, and he just wanted his arm to do the talking. I remember this was the same circumstance that happened with Lamar Jackson a couple years ago, where everyone was looking at Lamar's feet, look at how talented he was of a runner and potentially moving wide receiver. However, Lamar was like, no, let me let my arm do the talking, and he still became a first-round talent. And drafting him essentially took Joe Flacco off the job. The reason why I mention all this is because of the way that scouting goes this year. Because I think aside from the players, the next set of people who have the hardest time with the new changes is the scouts. Players and coaches, they're more or less in the same boat. They have to show up to practice, they have to do the workouts, etc. They got to create a game plan, all that. However, a lot of it doesn't change. The way a coach coaches, the way a player executes, the way they watch film, the way they communicate to each other, the way players come and go, all that doesn't really change that much for a coach or for a player. However, for a scout, this is a very different story. Because one of the biggest things that scouts rely on is really one of two things. They focus on first-hand experience, so being able to see the games live or being able to be on the sidelines or being able to attend practices, which they can't do because a lot of those stadiums didn't allow it to have capacity. And the other one is through tape. And physically talking to not only the player, but their coaches, their personal coaches, their families, etc. And once again, that's not as readily available when attendance to a lot of these stadiums is minimal. In some cases, none at all. Or when everything is done on Zoom, meaning that it's really difficult to have some of these larger meetings because there's probably everything's being held on Zoom, so on and so forth. So when that all happens, it makes a scout's job really difficult. So then what do they have after that? All they've got left after that is tape. Lots and lots of footage in tape. And this makes the scout's job extra hard. I was mentioning this in the last segment, or I guess last week's episode, where I mentioned that one of the reporters for the NFL Network, he said flat out that the scouts are going to have the hardest job this year because of the fact that they have the least amount of tape to go off of. And a lot of what the drafting is going to be based off of is going to be a lot of projections. So you might have a player who in junior year looked like a potential second rounder because of the talent that he showed, but because the season got canceled senior year, that's all the film he can go to. Plus the pro days, plus maybe if there's any practice footage available, who knows? Any footage of their personal workouts, that's all they get. And this is for any sport in the world. Every sport. Football, hockey, basketball, track and field, swimming, whatever it may be. Game speed and practice speeds are two completely different things. It's one thing for a quarterback to be throwing at some targets or to be throwing at a coach. It's another thing when he has to throw to his receivers, make the check at the line of scrimmage, adjust to the defense, and have to throw into triple coverage with 4 linemen in your face. It's different when you're a wide receiver just running the route versus when you have a corner and a safety doubling you and you got to break out of the coverage. They're two completely different animals. So I don't exactly know how the whole scouting side of things is really going to be affected because we haven't seen it yet. My only good guess is that scouting is going to suck this year. A lot. Because of the lack of available resources that they have. Whether if it is the film or the availability of in-person interactions, etc. It makes it a lot more difficult. And I also remember watching this video about the 2019 rookie class for the Buffalo Bills. And one of the big things that head coaches, Sean McDermott, the offensive, defensive coordinators, Brian Daboll, Leslie Frazier, general manager Brandon Beane, owner of the Pagulas, etc. I remember this one specific thing they noticed is that when they step in for that in-person interview, I would sometimes, and you might not think it's a big deal, but it actually is, they would comment about a player's size. Or they'd comment about the certain response that a player was giving, because you could see, their full body language, their full facial structure, their facial emotions, the nonverbal communication they have, whether if it's in their head or their face or their rest of their body. The rest of the nonverbal is really given away. And just the overall presence that they give really is important, especially for interviewing skills and psych evals and character issues. Those are super important. And a lot of that gets lost because of everything going on. You don't really get to see how big someone is when you're looking through a screen. The only thing you have is based on maybe like the upper body. If they do like show, what they look like in front of like a screen, it's not the same. And maybe it might be different if they see it, but if it's, from afar, 6 feet distance, it's not the same idea versus when you're standing in front of someone. I've met a lot of people who, when they're far away, they look one way, but when you get right next to them, the size is truly telling. Whether if it's someone who's shorter than you expected or taller than you expected or is exactly what you thought, in terms of the size of a person, especially when it comes to these National Football League players who are easily in the 200-pound range, most of which go anywhere from like 5'8" to like 6'8", that in-person experience is so much more important. I've met people where I see them on a screen and I expect one thing. It's actually happened to this one person who I worked with. I met them through Zoom because we did our initial set of meetings on Zoom. And I expected, it's just this one, it's just a person, they're probably, in my head, for some reason, I had the ballpark of like 5'6", 5'7" in my head, because for some reason you just make an educated guess. But no, I kind of go into the first day in person and I noticed that, the person I was doing this one interview with was actually 5'10", and I was like, that's a lot different than I expected. But good to know. Because your perception of what you see, even in numbers, is not anything compared to what you see in real life. You can watch a video of a player going, let's say 4.4 at the 40 time. But if you see it from, let's say, the stands, or if you see it from the sideline, that 4.4 40, it looks a lot different versus on a screen. And it kind of shows how much more difficult scouting is going to be this year. And honest to God, this draft is going to be very difficult because of that reason. Because scouting is so much more ambiguous and there's so many more question marks and there's so much more who knows what's going to happen, there's a lot of confusion going around. There's going to be a lot of reaches. And there's most likely going to be a lot of players who end up for a different team than they should have. Simply because there wasn't enough footage, there wasn't enough tape, and wasn't enough knowledge about what was going on. And I can't wait to see where this goes, especially with the next set of pro day videos coming out. Because I've actually watched a couple of the new ones that came out. Some of these guys actually showed a lot of good stuff. The first one I watched was Sam Ellinger, the quarterback for the Texas Longhorns, and I thought he looked really good in the regular season, but when I saw him on the pro day, I got really concerned for him, where he is going to be most likely a late round draft pick, But the thing that I saw with Ellinger is he's most likely going to play the same role that is currently being assumed by the only other Texas quarterback in the NFL, which is Colt McCoy, which is a likely career backup. Ellinger throws a lot of wobblers, and the balls are not that pretty. And low-key, that scares me. If I'm an NFL GM and I have a quarterback who just does not throw a great ball, that scares me. Especially in the way that the league is constructed right now, where you need to be able to move around and shift around and scramble and throw off balance. If he doesn't throw a great ball in those types of situations, the career is not going to be great. Especially since Ellinger, a quarterback of the Big Ten, is not exactly playing the best defenses around. So not only does he not throw the greatest ball, but it's even worse because they were off-balanced and it didn't look good then either. And one thing that I just thought was just plain weird when I saw Ellinger's pro day highlights, which is that he was throwing to still receivers. Like, instead of having a receiver on the line of scrimmage running a full route, you'd see, like, a receiver just standing there at the hash marks, and then he just runs to the sideline for an out route. Which, to me, just makes no sense at all. Why pretend to run the out route when you can just run the actual out route? Or why pretend to run the slant when you can just run the actual slant? It just didn't make sense to me. I thought it was really weird. Especially because receivers were only running parts of routes for some reason. And a lot of times when they actually did have the receiver on the line of scrimmage, for Sam Ellinger at least, it was usually some sort of deep ball. Or it was something intermediate to deep. And whenever I saw Ellinger wind up for any of these types of throws, one thing I noticed was that a lot of the receivers had to adjust to his ball. Which means that he's not always throwing it in the perfect spot. To be fair, not everyone does. But it has to at least be in a spot where it is manageable. And it has to be at least in an area where it is catchable and good for the yards after catch. Especially in this NFL game where defensive backs are at the top of their game. I mean, I kind of saw the same thing when you looked at Trey Lance from North Dakota State. And one thing I didn't remember until I was listening to Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks and all of them in the video for Trey Lance from North Dakota State was that he doesn't have a game in 2020, 2021. He only had one game played. He didn't have a full season. And all the tape that we have right now is going to kind of skip that bit of progression. So in terms of what he's done in the last 2 years, that pro day is it. And for me personally, he looked great, by the way. He looked really good. He has a very clean, deep ball. And essentially, what I mean by that is that if he tries to chuck a deep ball and it's on target, he is throwing darts. But if the deep balls are off target, they were very off target. Which is kind of a very similar fate that I saw, especially in the rookie year of a guy like Josh Allen. A little bit of that with Justin Herbert, but not exactly. More along the lines of Allen's rookie and second year in the league. It's a very similar type of ball. It's a very similar type of throw. Where if I could trace the trajectory of the ball, it's actually very linear. It's actually not very archy. It's very straightforward, and it's very strong, too. It's got a lot of power and a lot of oomph, as some people would say, in his arm. A lot of that zip, a lot of that drive. It's very Josh Allen, very Justin Herbert-like. Especially when you consider that he hasn't really played for 2 years. Or especially when you consider the fact that he has a very powerful style of play. And one thing that I noticed I thought was really interesting, at least for Trey Lance, is that his QB coach is Quincy Avery. And he's had a host of pretty good QBs, to say the least. Deshaun Watson is one of them. Dwayne Haskins is one of them. Trey Lance as well as Justin Fields are both coached by Quincy Avery. Which means that Avery really specializes in mobile quarterbacks. You saw when I discussed Trevor Lawrence last week, I talked about Jordan Palmer. They specific more on the passing element of it. Josh Allen this year really exploded as a pocket passer. Sam Darnold, while mobile, is a little more of a pure passer. Trevor Lawrence is a much refined athlete, but he's a very good passer. Jordan Palmer is one of those guys, and he focuses more on the passing element of it. Quincy Avery has a lot of these guys where they're really good as dual threats, and they can really make a big impact in the run game especially. So kind of having that mixed element of it, that extra threat, or I guess that second option available, is something that Avery really responds well to. And the last player I'm going to focus on in terms of the pro days is going to be Clemson wide receiver Travis Etienne. Now, Etienne, from what I saw, was mostly combine drills. You saw stuff like the 40, the vertical, the broad jump, the bench. But that's really all you can see out of Etienne. And to be fair, he had some pretty good results. He ran a 4.41 in the 40, which is the same as Indianapolis Colts wide receiver, Indianapolis Colts running back Jonathan Taylor, as well as the Washington football team's linebacker Montez Sweat. He got a 33.5 vertical jump, which is the same as Josh Allen, the Buffalo Bills. And he also got a 10'8" broad jump, which is actually really high up there in terms of the broad jump. And that actually is the equivalent of Miami Dolphins tight end Mike Gesicki. And he actually also ran an 18-rep bench, which is the same as Denver Broncos wide receiver Cortland Sutton. So if you take just the combine stats alone, it was really solid overall. The only thing I wish I saw more of from the footage of Travis Etienne's pro day is more of his actual stuff. Some footwork drills, maybe something with running between the tackles or something like that, or just something about the drills, whatever. Just something for running backs. Because I understand why they kind of resort through the combine drills for running backs, because for running backs, that's the big thing. But I just wanted to see more. The only footage I could find was combine drills, and it just wasn't enough for me. It just didn't do it for me. But we'll see as more come along. We'll see more pro days and more evaluations. That's all I've got in terms of the pro days, as well as the changes made to NFL scouting. And coming up right after the break, we have a very interesting rating coming from one of the top sports broadcasters in the NFL game. That's all coming up right after this.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
GSMC Podcast Network. And we just talked about some of the changes in scouting as well as the pro day footage that has been coming up and about slowly but surely. And now we're going into something a little unconventional. I'm going to be breaking down something from the media. And it's going to be something that I don't really do very often. I usually like to consume other reporters or other journalists or analysts or whatever, because not only do I want to see what they know and hear their opinions and thoughts, but I also want to see what they're doing and what they're seeing, and to see if it lines up with what I'm seeing. One of the things that I always pay attention to, because it's just something I love to do, it's just fun, is rankings. Because a lot of rankings, they're either one of two things. They're either absolutely outstanding and perfect and shouldn't be having any issues whatsoever, or they're absolutely horrendous and shouldn't be touched with a 10-foot pole. And now there's this expression, especially when it comes to a lot of industries, especially statistically, which is that if it happens one time, you never know what it is. It could be a fluke, it could be an anomaly, it could just be one of those things. If it happens 2 times, it's good luck. But if it happens 3 or more times, then clearly it's a trend. And this one specific sports reporter has actually been making the top quarterbacks list for quite some time now. And because this is his 4th year doing it, he's done 3 already. And so far, out of everything I've seen, I personally have agreed with all of his rankings so far, at least from what I've seen so far, because of the fact that it just tends to line up that way. Whether if it is the way that the careers have gone so far, whether if it is how good the players have become since getting drafted, so on and so forth. Most of the time, the specific individual has been hitting the nail on the head. Of course, there's 1 or 2 here and there where I don't exactly agree, but generally speaking, he's pretty on the money. And this is actually from NBC Sports. Former NFL quarterback Chris Sims, actually the son of Hall of Fame quarterback Phil Simms. Now, Chris Sims is actually a very good and very detail-oriented broadcaster and reporter for NBC. And he focuses a lot on Sunday Night Football as a studio analyst, but he's also a tandem along with not just the Chris Sims Unbuttoned podcast, but also he works with Pro Football Talk on NBCSN. And one of the things that came out, this actually came out a little while ago, I just haven't gotten a chance to review it, is his quarterback rankings for the 2021 quarterback class. And the reason why I mentioned it is because he's been pretty on the money for the last several years. And it's actually kind of scary how accurate Sims has been, but it's not that crazy, especially when you consider the fact that he is a former NFL quarterback himself, and his dad is a Hall of Fame quarterback as well. So, of course, all that knowledge, he's going to apply it. And let me go into some of the previous rankings. So let me go into 2019, because this is the one that I think is the most inaccurate of the last 3 years. In 2019, Chris Sims' quarterback rankings went as follows. Daniel Jones at number 6. Jarrett Simmons number 5. Ryan Finley is number 4. Dwayne Haskins at 3. Drew Lock at number 2. And the number 1 quarterback was Kyler Murray. Now, we know through what we've seen so far in the careers, Daniel Jones is 3rd on that list, maybe 2nd. Kyler Murray is without a doubt number 1. Finley and Stidham are at the bottom of that edge. But the only one he gets wrong, and it's kind of a big one, is Daniel Jones. Jones should be 2nd or 3rd on that list. Because the last several years, Kyler's made a Pro Bowl. Daniel Jones has been slowly rebuilding the reputation of the New York Giants. Drew Lock, he kind of has a make it or break it year this year. And Dwayne Haskins kind of has some character issues, works his way out of Washington. And then you had the rankings he had of last year's quarterbacks. At number 5, he had Jacob Eason. Number 4, he had Tua Tagovailoa. Number 3, he had Jordan Love. At number 2, he had Justin Herbert. And number 1, he had Joe Burrow. This one is a little early to tell because we've seen nothing out of Jordan Love. And especially because a lot of Dolphins fans have been clamoring for replacing Tua after only 1 year. But as of right now, this one's pretty spot on, actually. It's actually really difficult to tell because we've seen nothing out of Jordan Love or Jacob Eason, but at least out of the quarterbacks we have seen, it most likely does go Burrow, followed by Herbert, followed by Tua. But the one that honestly strikes me, and this is the one that shocks me the most because of how spot on it was, is Sims' ranking of 2018. He goes Rosen in last because Rosen, as of right now, can't get out of the practice squad, can't even be a viable backup. And then you get Sam Darnold, who is actually a very feasible quarterback. However, the Jets are so abysmal, they're trying to get rid of him. And because of the Jets' inability to properly develop players, Darnold had actually significantly regressed. And then 3rd, you got Baker Mayfield, who's actually been slowly improving as his career's gone on. Josh Allen, number 2, who's actually made the biggest jump of all quarterbacks and has actually been in the MVP discussion of this last season. And then you have Lamar Jackson, already won an MVP, has already made a household name, former Heisman winner. What more is there to say about Lamar? And the reason why I mentioned those is because for almost every single time he's done this so far, the number 1 and number 2 quarterbacks are almost without a doubt right on the money. And for the most part, they're in the correct order. The only one I might have reservations about is Burrow and Herbert, but we also haven't seen enough of Burrow. And depending on how next year goes, Allen might be able to jump Lamar. But let me go from the bottom up, actually, because the list is actually very surprising to me. He actually took Trey Lance from North Dakota State. He actually put him at the bottom at 6th. And these are the top 6 at least. The biggest thing that Sims puts against Trey Lance is that does not having a season really hurt his progression as well as his draft stock. Yes, not having enough tape on him really hurts his draft stock, sure, but it's going to really stunt his progression as well, because that's 1 year where he essentially got wasted. And the fact that he's so raw and hasn't really had much playing experience, does that either hurt his ability to grow, or does it just show that there's still so much left to prove? And that same question was actually brought about with Josh Allen, which is why a lot of scouts and reporters are comparing Lance to Allen, because Allen came in very raw, not a lot of experience, same with Lance. However, the difference with Allen is he had at least 2 seasons under his belt. Lance only has 1. So we'll have to see where that goes. But as of the immediacy, Lance does not have a lot to offer. At least in terms of how game-changing he will be when he enters the franchise. If he enters a franchise, he's going to take a lot of time to develop and work and grow. And speaking of growth, this actually goes into the number 5 quarterback of Sims' ranking, which I was really unsure about at the time. But then when he explains it, it makes a little more sense. And then when I watched some highlights, and paired that up, I was like, now I kind of see it. And Justin Fields is actually put at the 5th. And some of the biggest things that Sims puts against Field is that the ball isn't very well thrown because his mechanics are off. And upon watching some highlights on the throws where you're just like, ooh, like, are you sure about that? That's what he's talking about. Those throws were just off because the mechanics just weren't great. And the fact that Fields is a guy who naturally tends to fixate on the first read is a little bit problematic. You're going to the NFL, a place where you can't go to your first read, because 9 times out of 10, your first read is your best receiver, and in those cases, the defensive coordinators of the other team or the head coaches plan around that and they double him. And then you get the guy in the slot who's open, or maybe that running back who just checks out. You can't fixate on the first read. You can't force things to your first person. You can't have a team where one player or one receiver is just so dominant at racking up the yardage and racking up the points, but leaving some of the other receivers, not really available to get touches. And it especially isn't helpful when you consider how Ohio State just isn't the strongest quarterback school. Name me one quarterback from Ohio State who's had a very successful career. Like, the only ones I can think of, they've all been flameouts. Dwayne Haskins. You had Cardale Jones. R.J. Barrett. And all the quarterbacks I can think of who did go to Ohio State, they transferred out. Joe Burrow's an excellent example of that. If I'm not mistaken, I want to say Kyler Murray was as well. They tend to leave Ohio State because it's not the strongest quarterback school. Or because they lose a starting job, go to somewhere else and develop significantly better. And the one thing that Fields has going as advantage is the same thing that was said about Lamar when he came in, which is that he could potentially balance the not-so-strong running ability. he could potentially balance out the not-so-strong throwing ability with his running ability. It can kind of balance everything out. It can kind of work its way back in there. It can find its way and rebalance itself out there. But going to only one read at a time is kind of where a lot of mistakes happen. And someone who doesn't really allow a lot of mistakes to happen is actually Sims' number 4 quarterback, Kellen Mond. Senior Bowl MVP, doesn't really make a lot of mistakes. And is actually pretty accurate, actually. But one of the biggest issues that Sims had in Mond's game is that the lack of calculated risks is troublesome, especially in a program like the SEC, especially when you have to face up against some of these top defenses. You're kind of taking the easy way out. You're not taking any calculated risks to really force anything to your team. It explains why Mond only had 19 touchdowns during the year, because the lack of calculated risks was just not really there. But someone who really did take a lot of calculated risks was the number 3 quarterback in this list, which is Mac Jones. He was going ham during the season. He's a very quick decision maker. He can shift around in the pocket. He's got his feet available if needed. And he did face a lot of the top defensive programs, especially in a conference like the SEC. You know, he faced Texas A&M. He's faced Georgia, Alabama, Florida. And then we get to the CFP, you get Notre Dame and Ohio State. And he sets all sorts of records during the time in Bama. He sets a Bama school record, 4,500 yards. And he sets a pair of NCAA records, a 203 quarterback rating, and 77% completion percentage. An NCAA record, both of them. But my biggest concern about Jones is that, is he as talented as he is? Is he that good? Or is he a result of the talent around him? And that's the part that scares me a little bit about Mac Jones. Is that you get guys like Najee Harris. You get guys like Devonta Smith. You get guys like Jalen Waddle. You get that amazing defense. You get Nick Saban's coaching. Couldn't elevate those quarterbacks. I can't even think of the last successful quarterback to get drafted straight out of Alabama. Because fans are already calling for Tua to get benched or to get traded or something, to move on. Jalen Hurts didn't really explode until he went to Oklahoma. The most notable Alabama quarterback I can think of in recent memory, and I mean recent memory, is A.J. Mccarron. He's a backup. Nothing against Mac Jones. He's a great player. But is he just a product of everything around him? And this was the question asked by Sims. However, from my point of view, it's not the case. Which is, for actually, surprisingly, number 2 is Trevor Lawrence. Is having guys like Travis Etienne, is having guys like Amari Rodgers, Dabo Sweeney, all that. Does that affect the way he plays? Does that affect the offense that was run around him? Is he going to have the same outcome when he has a team like Jacksonville who doesn't really have a defense, who doesn't really have an offensive line? The entirety of their weapons is the running back, Robinson. That's it. And DJ Chark. And Laviska Shenault. And that's about it. On the bright side, he's at least going to be able to come in with a lot of young, good weapons. But with no line and with no real defense to help him out except for C.J. Hendrickson, who they drafted last year, that's about it. But one of the big things that I think Trevor Lawrence is going to have going to him is that he is very talented. He's been named the best prospect since Andrew Luck. And he has been slowly improving year by year every time with Clemson. Every time he steps on the field, he gets slowly and slowly better and better, which is a good thing. A thing you want to see. And surprisingly enough, Chris Sims named Zach Wilson his number 1 quarterback. And this one actually shocked me. But part of the reason why they did so is because he has huge improvements in his game. He is able to develop and to grow, especially at a smaller school like BYU where there's less talent to work with. You know, guys like Josh Allen went to Wyoming. Patrick Mahomes went to Texas Tech. Like, I didn't even know those schools really existed until those guys came onto the scene. Ben Roethlisberger went to University of Miami. Miami, Ohio. Like, you see this example over and over and over again. Like, Drew Brees went to Purdue. It's not even really a football powerhouse. First thing I think of Purdue is basketball. You get a lot of those guys from smaller name schools who have less to work with, and because the receivers aren't as talented, the windows are already small, or because they're more in these conditions where they're unlikely to succeed, or I guess less likely to succeed, because the receiving cores are weaker, because of the fact the overall team is weaker. It gives them a significant edge in the NFL when they finally have great receivers to throw to. Like, Patrick Mahomes is not Patrick Mahomes without Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. Josh Allen doesn't explode as Josh Allen without Cole Beasley and Stephon Diggs. And some of the major gaps you see in Zach Wilson's game really show in the numbers as well. His completion percentage goes from 62 to 73. His yards per game goes from 264 to 307. His yards per attempt goes from 7 to 11. And his touchdown to interception ratio goes from 14.9 to 43.3. Those are massive jumps in his game. It shows the potential of how much he can improve and how much he can continue to just get better and better no matter what he does. It's a sign that the growth potential is 100% there. It really shows that everything that he does is a sign of improvement. And this is what I mean when I said earlier in the scouting report where I said that it's going to be a lot of projection. It's going to be a lot of what they can do in the future, not so much what they can do now. And I can't wait to see how all this pans out in the draft. That's all I got for you today. I can't wait to see you guys next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to give us a 5 stars, and make sure to share us everywhere you go. Make sure to write us a comment. It really helps us out. Don't forget to like us on all of your favorite social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And make sure that you find us anywhere that you go. We really appreciate it. Sorry the episodes have not really been coming out as consistently as I like. I'm sorry that the uploading schedule and the length of these episodes have been absolutely all over the place. I've been a little bit ill as of late, but don't worry about it. I'm back 100% once again, so everything should be back all right and consistent. And with that being said, for all of us here at the GSMC Podcast Network, this has been the GSMC College Football Podcast. My name is Ryan Lee. Have a great rest of your night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.